Hi, I'm Stephen Dumont from the Department of Philosophy, and it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague and office mate, 3 doors down, Therese Cory. Therese is, I think, this whole conference in a way is an outgrowth of Therese's long-standing interest in philosophy of mind, and her main book, I would say, is entitled Aquinas on Self-Knowledge with Cambridge University Press. And so today she's going to present a paper on her research in this area, The Substrate of Thought, a Problem in Medieval Metaphysics of Knowing. It's all yours, Therese.
So for many readers today, what's interesting about medieval cognition theories is their disputes about how mind reaches outside itself to objects beyond. That's most of the medieval philosophy of mind literature. And there's a historical reason for this history. 19th and 20th century neo-scholastics portrayed mind's great achievement, indeed what makes it be mind, as its ability to, quote, contain the other as the other, end quote. Following alongside, Brentano cites the scholastics of the Middle Ages as holding that, quote, every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself. And these references do echo an important strain of 13th and 14th century thought, which says that pelicans or roses are in the mind only in a special intentional being, or esse intentionale. And this might be a special relationality to objects or a spooky, shadowy being. We talk a lot about spooky being around here. But either way, it is exiled from the realm of the real being, or esse reale, that pelicans or roses have in themselves, and perhaps even exiled from the structure of Aristotelian categories altogether. But in focusing on these themes, we're at risk of neglecting an alternative medieval tradition, which is concerned with the nature of thought as one nature among many, and the metaphysics of this nature, namely its properties, its coming to be, its typical activities, and its teleological development. And in this paper, I want to bring to light a special problem in this tradition, which we can call the problem of the substrate of thought. This problem springs from 2 theses that go back to the 2nd century Greek commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias. So first thesis, that thought is one of the main kinds of what is alongside body. And then second, that we humans are able to acquire the being of thought. And this acquiring of thought immediately triggers a metaphysical problem. So compare, when my cold hands acquire heat from a stove, I wrote this when the temperature wasn't 75 degrees out. The heat, which is an accident, is received into my flesh, the substrate. So then we might wonder, is the same true for the acquisition of thought? When I begin thinking, is there some substrate in me that receives thought? And if so, what kind of substrate? Intellect or something else? In response, some thinkers in this tradition standardize their account of how being is acquired across both bodily being or thought being. Both, they say, involve the reception of a form in a substrate. But others worried that the metaphysics of substrates acquiring forms cannot explain what happens when I begin to think. So they invoke, for instance, 1, the identity of intellect and intelligible. So they say if intellect must be the intelligible, and it cannot be composed with the intelligible as a substrate. And secondly, also evoke the unaffectability of intellect. If intellect is unaffectable, it can't receive something as a substrate receives a form. Or they claim that, 3, composition is essentially bound up with material extension and is thus restricted to bodily beings. This is the slightly more puzzling claim. So for instance, Boethius claims that immaterial natures cannot receive accidents. And some Neoplatonic commentators insisted that the Aristotelian categories themselves, with their distinctions among substance and the 9 categories of accidents, apply only to bodily being. Now, these disputes over the problem of the substrate of thought are not little squabbles about arcane metaphysical terminology. Fundamentally, what is at stake is the extent to which thought is a nature like other natures, part of what is, and the extent to which metaphysical structures can be standardized across both bodily being and thought being. So questions about a unified metaphysics. And also, I think this picks up on themes that we were talking earlier about the differentiation of thought. So when we're talking about metaphysical structure, what kind of structure is present? How is thought differentiated, or how is it complex? So I'll proceed in two stages. First, I unpack how the problem of the substrate of thought develops in the Greco-Arabic De Intellectu tradition, which consists of Alexander of Aphrodisias' On Intellect, or Peri Nu, also known as the De Anima Mentissa. And I follow Sharples in accepting the authenticity of this text. I'm just going to take that for granted here. The second is Al-Kindi's Letter on Intellect from 9th century Baghdad, and Al-Farabi's On Intellect from 10th century Baghdad. And I will excavate the problem's origins and two emerging solutions, which I'm going to call the potency in a substrate view, which seeks to standardize metaphysical structure across body and thought, and an opposing merging forms view that treats the structure of thought being as sui generis. Then in the second part of the paper, moving to the medieval Latin world, I'm going to discuss the more extensive treatment of the same problem in a fourth De Intellectu treatise by the 13th century Dominican scholastic Albert the Great, who offers what I would like to call the progressive determination view. And this view is going to split the difference on the standardizing of metaphysical structure. It doesn't make the structure of thought being completely sui generis, but it does exclude composition from thought. Yet the undertow of medieval Latin metaphysics in the 13th century tugs toward standardization. And this trend, I think, is paradoxically at least partly responsible for the ultimate transformation of the intelligible into the intentional object and its exiling from the realm of real being. Part 1, a substrate for thought. And most of the main texts are on your handout. So first subsection is the origins of the problem. Our story begins with an innocuous taxonomy of beings by the Greek commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias. Alexander divides all the beings into two genera, which he calls sensibles and intelligibles. These two genera correspond to two conditions of form, enmattered forms and matterless forms. Seems like a kind of standard Platonic two-world ontology. But Alexander adds two important twists. First, he holds that to be intelligible or a matterless form is to be an intellect. So in his treatise De Intellectu, he writes, quote, if then, this is not on your handout. If then there is any of the beings that is intelligible in actuality in its own nature, and because it is immaterial has of itself to be such, not deriving it from an intellect that separates it from matter, such a thing is intellect in actuality always, for what is intelligible in actuality is intellect. In other words, an intelligible form is not a dead immaterial form or inert object of philosophical speculation, but always a thinker. This makes perfect sense once we realize that for Alexander, quote, intelligizing consists in having the intelligized form. I would have said also for Aristotle, but now that after hearing John's paper, I'm rethinking that. To have an immaterial form is, for Alexander, to have thought. Therefore, each immaterial form is a thought and also a thinker. So right away, we can see that Alexander's division of beings into sensibles and intelligibles is actually a division into, on the one side, bodies, and on the other side, thoughts that think. And I'm going to use thought wherever the tradition uses intelligible in this paper to underscore that point. Second, Alexander holds that if a form is not matterless by nature, it can be made matterless through abstraction, thereby becoming a thought. For instance, the naturally enmattered forms of a squirrel or a pelican can be dematerialized, and when that happens, they become squirrel thought and pelican thought, and we acquire them as our human thoughts. Thought, therefore, not only naturally exists as a substance in its own right, but is also something acquired by us humans as an accident to which we are in potency. And it's this notion of acquiring thought being that triggers the problem of the substrate of thoughts. Can my acquiring squirrel thought be analyzed in the same way as my skin's acquiring a tan, with some pre-existing substrate taking on thought as an accident? Or is this kind of analysis proper only to bodily substances and accidents? So let's look at the Greco-Arabic de intellectu tradition as a whole then to see how Alexander himself, and then also Kindi and Farabi, handle this problem. So it's natural to conclude that if there's a substrate for thought in us human beings, it must be what Aristotle calls the intellect that becomes all, invoking the fact that for every genus, there is some common matter that receives different specific forms, as flesh and blood is the proper matter for animals, but can sustain different animal forms. This intellect is later labeled material intellect, or nous helikos, a term coined by Alexander himself and carried on by the Arabic commentary tradition, which becomes the possible intellect or potential intellect of the Latin tradition. Nevertheless, all our de intellectu treatises deny that this intellect in us should be understood as a substrate for intelligible form. Roughly, they all insist instead that it becomes identical with the thoughts we receive. But they diverge on what exactly this intellect is in itself, prior to our acquiring thought, and whether there is any other substrate for intelligible form if intellect isn't it. So let's look at their different views. Alexander offers what we could call a potency in a substrate view. So in his De Intellectu, Alexander himself explains that his label material intellect should be interpreted not as a substrate, but rather as the substrate's potency for form. And the text is on your handout. He says, I say material, not because it is something that underlies like matter, for I say matter of something which underlies and is able to become a this something through the presence of some form. Rather, since matter's being matter consists in its having the potentiality for all things, it follows that that in which there is potentiality, and indeed that which is potential, insofar as it is such, is material. And so the intellect which is not yet thinking, but has the potentiality to come to be like this, is material. And it's this sort of potentiality of the soul that is the material intellect, not being in actuality any of the extant things, but having the potentiality for becoming all of them. More vividly in his De Anima, he states that material intellect is analogous not to the tablet that receives writing, but rather to the tablet's, quote, suitability, epiteideotes, for being written on. So consider that a tablet is a substrate that has a potency for lettering. What undergoes change and acquires the form is the tablet, the substrate, not its potency for lettering. The potency is just one of two conditions of lettering in the tablet. The letters can be actual or potential. Crucially, a potency does not undergo change, nor does it receive form. Rather, potential lettering gives way to actual lettering as someone writes on the tablet. Similarly, Alexander is claiming that material intellect is not a subject or substrate affected by, or joined to, or receiving intelligible forms. Rather, it is a potency for intelligible form, which is to say it is a potential thought, or all the potential thoughts. What motivates Alexander's potency in a substrate view? First of all, there's the identity of intellect and thought, which has to apply not just to self-subsisting thoughts, but also to our human thoughts. If material intellect composes with thoughts, they will not be truly identical. But if intellect just is thought, then obviously our material intellect cannot be intellect in the proper sense, the full sense of actuality. Otherwise, we would already have thought, and then it would not be in potency to all thought. So to solve the problem, it has to be a potency for intellect, or potential intellect. And it's the realization of that potency which is actual intellect, or actual thought, in us. And that is why Alexander makes the remarkable claim that when I acquire a pelican thought, or the abstracted form of pelican, dematerialized pelican form, that form is my actual intellect. What thinks in me is just immaterial pelican form. And there's a text describing this on a handout at the bottom of the first page, which I will not read. Effectively, I would suggest this means that Alexander is rejecting a certain kind of duality of thinker and thoughts. So the kind of duality that would mean that some pre-established human mind, as a sort of one thing, acquires thoughts as something else, items distinct from itself. Rather, for Alexander, thoughts are mind. Thoughts are all the thinking there is, and thinking is all there is to mind. Now, Alexander's second motivation for the potency in a substrate view is the Aristotelian dictum that intellect is not affected. So as we just saw, substrates, like the tablet, are affected. They undergo change in receiving form. But, very conveniently for Alexander, potencies are, properly speaking, actualized, not affected. So when I receive dematerialized pelican form, if my intellect is just thought in potency, it is not affected by that form. Rather, it is realized as that form. It just is pelican thought brought from potency to actuality in me. And that's in another text from De Anima, which I'm also not reading. But he makes specifically the point about the unaffectability of intellect there. So, of course, all this leaves Alexander with a problem. What then is the substrate for potential and actual thought in us? And it's a little tricky to figure out what Alexander's view is on this, but it seems to be in De Intellectu that for him the answer is that some bodily organ of ours has a potency for thought being in the same way that my skin has a potency for sunburn. So the bodily organ would be the substrate affected by the actualizing of thought. So to summarize, what's happening in Alexander is a standardizing of metaphysical structure across all beings. Wherever being is acquired, whether material or thought, there is always a substrate with a potency for X, which acquires actual X. Now, a different response to the problem of the substrate of thought, which we can call the merging forms view, appears in the De Intellectu treatises by Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, although they echo the main insights of Alexander's response. Kindi, one of the earliest adopters of Greek philosophy in 9th century Baghdad, agrees with Alexander in rejecting any substrate role for the human intellect, which he equates with the human soul. So he says that soul does not receive thoughts like, quote, something that is in a container, or, quote, a pattern in the body. The soul, he says, is one thing, not another thing, nor an otherness like the otherness of predicates, end quote. In other words, soul and the intelligible form pelican are not two composed things in the manner of a subject and predicate, apple and red, for instance. Thus, Kindi concludes, and the text is puzzling unless you think about it in terms of this background problem of substrates. He says, when the form of the intellect becomes the same thing as the soul, it and the form of the intellect are not different from one another, because the two are not divided and thus distinct from one another. When the form of the intellect becomes one with it, then it and the intellect are one thing. So it intellects and is intellected. Thus the intellect and what is intellected are a single thing with respect to the soul. End quote. Clearly, the identity of intellect and intelligible is part of why Kindi thinks intellect cannot be a substrate for thought. They would not be a single thing if they were composed as substrate and form. But Kindi does not take Alexander's route of making intellect a potency of the substrate instead. Rather, he identifies intellect with the soul itself, while denying, strikingly, that this soul intellect is a substrate for thought either. And the reason he gives is that, quote, soul is not corporeal or divisible. So it looks as though Kindi thinks that immaterial things cannot be substrates for accidents, though he doesn't explain why not. Strikingly then, on Kindi's view, in the acquiring of thought, nothing functions as a substrate for thought, because the substrate-accident relationship simply does not apply to thought being. Instead, Kindi offers a sui generis metaphysics for the acquisition of thought, namely, the soul/intellect, itself already being a certain immaterial form or thought, appears to absorb newly acquired forms into itself, merging with them. Roughly the same picture appears in Al-Farabi's De Intellectu, who adds a riveting modification of Aristotle's seal in the wax analogy that we saw quoted, I believe, in Caleb's paper. So what he says is that, moreover, this intellect does not itself remain so distinct from the forms of the intelligibles that it and the forms stand removed from themselves from one another. Rather, this intellect itself becomes those forms. It is as though you were to imagine the impression and mold through which a piece of wax takes on the form of a cube or sphere, and that form sinks into it, spreads through it, and entirely engulfs its length, breadth, and depth. Then that piece of wax will have become that very form with no distinction between what it is and what that form is. This is mind-blowing. It is by way of this example that you should understand the coming to be of the forms of existing things in that thing that Aristotle in De Anima calls the potential intellect, end quote. This is more than mere colorful metaphor. Farabi is trying to illustrate the metaphysics of acquiring thought being. The metaphysics of composition is restricted to material beings, in which the substrate, or what he calls corporeal matters, is only superficially composed with a form which is thereby always held at a distance. Thus, in Farabi's picture, there's no such thing as immaterial composition. For the being of thought, composition is replaced by the merging of form with form. Okay, second part, on to Albert the Great and the determination of the indeterminate. Some 4 centuries later, a new De Intellectu treatise, this time by the 13th century Dominican Albert the Great, explicitly takes up these conundra. Albert the Great, of course, is best known as the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, but he was a brilliant philosopher in his own right and a champion and experienced reader of the newly translated Greek and Arabic texts that were then gaining a foothold in the young medieval European universities. He viewed them as a corpus of what he called peripatetic philosophy, roughly corresponding to the Neoplatonizing traditions of Greek late antiquity and classical Islam, but with Aristotle as its leader or princeps. One of Albert's great lifetime projects is a set of commentaries on the works of Aristotle that are more like a complete presentation of the peripatetic system, filling in gaps in the corpus with additional treatises of his own. One such treatise he calls De Intellectu et Intelligibili, in line with the earlier tradition of De Intellectu treatises by Alexander, Kindi, and Farabi. Indeed, Albert believes that Aristotle himself actually produced a treatise De Intellectu. He confesses he did not see it himself, although he has, quote, studied the many well-explained books and letters of his many disciples on the topic. And charmingly, for an author steeped to the eyeballs in Neoplatonism, he promises also to, quote, point out occasionally the words of Plato where he does not contradict the judgments of the peripatetics. Albert broaches the problem of the substrate of thought in his De Intellectu in discussing the problem of how the intelligible is in intellect. From the outset, he immediately denies that intellect and thought are one via composition, whether that is the composition of substance and accident or of matter and form. That's the first Albert text on your handout, but I won't read it out. Why does he deny this? In the ensuing discussion, Albert offers 3 reasons. First, he says, an accident does not have its accidental form and essence from its subject, but only its being. Secondly, in composing a substance, form is educed from matter through alteration. And third, a form in matter has material being. Now, these last 2 reasons are particularly puzzling because they seem to assume that anything playing the role of matter in thought would make thought be material. But Albert hasn't given us any reason to think that there could not be something immaterial, analogous to prime matter, that is the receptive principle for an intelligible form. And indeed, he follows the Aristotelian tradition in ascribing to the human being an intellect that becomes all things, or possible intellect. So why does he not welcome the notion of an immaterial thought matter or substrate? I want to suggest that it's the first of these 3 reasons that provides the tip-off to why Albert excludes all composition from thought being, not just substance and accident composition, but also that of a hypothetical immaterial matter and form. We can understand this point better from 2 clues which appear in his broader remarks about composition from his commentaries on the physics and the metaphysics. Our first clue is Albert's distinction from his commentary on the physics between 2 senses of substrate. In the paradigmatic sense, which applies only to substances, for instance, tulips or pelicans, a substrate is, quote, a being that is complete in itself, which is the cause of the accident existing in it. And then there's a lesser sense in which prime matter is what he calls a sort of substrate, or subjectum quodam, because it is, quote, not a complete being in itself, but in potency, subjected to a substantial form. For Albert, prime matter is a universal potency for material being. Now, the key difference here is that a substrate in the paradigmatic sense, full-blown substance, gives existence to the form it acquires, whereas the certain sort of substrate, prime matter, receives being from the form it acquires. Either way, however, the two constituents, the substrate and what it receives, constitute just one being. So in the first case, when the apple becomes red as it ripens, redness exists only as the redness of the existing apple, namely as a qualification of the being that is the apple's. The composing of apple and redness does not glue together two different beings, but makes an existing substance become qualified by a new accidental essence. In the second case, prime matter and form constituting a substance, these two constituents together constitute some one new thing which has just one being, or esse. That's our first clue. The second clue is Albert's insistence in several texts that regardless of the kind of substrate involved, a substrate always has a different essence from that of the form it receives. So for instance, in the commentary on the Metaphysics, he states that in matter-form pairings, matter and form are not of the same essence. This is obviously true of what he calls the proximate matter, the organized stuff that takes on a new form to become a new substance. So if you imagine a worm digesting an apple, the apple is the proximate matter being converted into worm flesh. The apple matter has the essence fruit, but the form it takes on has the essence worm. So the matter and the form have two different essences. But Albert also insists that similarly, prime matter and substantial form also have different essences. So if we look at the apple itself, composed of prime matter and apple form, these two components have different essences. Prime matter is a universal potency for form, and apple form belongs to the genus of fruit. So once again, the constituents of the one being that is an apple have different essences. In his commentary on the physics, Albert says the same is true of substance and accident. So for instance, apple and redness, substance and quality must be different in their essences. Otherwise, he said, and this is crucial, there would just be one essence, essentia, differing only in being, or esse. In other words, apple and redness would just be two ways of existing for one homogeneous mega-nature. The entire structure of the Aristotelian categories and all essential differences would collapse into monism, proposals that Albert dismisses as, and I quote, abuses and the worst errors against all philosophy. So where do these two clues leave us? Clue number 2 was that in any kind of composition, the components have different essences. Otherwise, the resulting unit wouldn't be a composite at all. And clue number 1 was that there's only ever one being, or esse, in a composite, which is either going to come from the substrate or from the form. The singleness of being is what makes the composite be one thing rather than an aggregate. And this gives us a picture of exactly what kind of structure Albert is denying to thought being in De Intellectu. What he's denying is that thought being is susceptible to the structure of composition, which he understands precisely as the unification of components that have different essences but participate in one being, esse. Only material beings can be thus composed, and thought being cannot. So with this in mind, we can make sense of a later chapter of De Intellectu where Albert evaluates 4 of Aristotle's descriptions of possible intellect, or the receiver of thought. The first of these is that possible intellect is an indivisible existing substance, which is potentially all things. Second, that it's a blank tablet, needing no further preparation to receive a picture. Third, the place of forms. And fourth, the species, meaning form or essence here, of intelligibles. And Aristotle's words are embellished by being fed through the philosophical filter of probably Kindi, Farabi, and Averroes. In evaluating which description is best, Albert repeatedly makes what we can now understand as the very significant claim that intellect and thought have one nature or essence and differ, when at all, only in being. The exact reverse of what he ascribes to composition. In a composite, there's one being whose components differ by essence. In thought, there is one essence, with any difference only being a difference in being. Thus, for example, consider how Albert interprets the first Aristotelian dictum that possible intellect becomes all things. Quote, When, therefore, possible intellect is called that in which all intelligibles come to be, this must be understood such that it is potentially every intelligible, one and the same, undivided and simple in its substance. And therefore, its potency whereby it becomes all intelligibles is not univocal with the potency of matter. For matter is not susceptible of all things while existing one indivisible, but rather by a division of itself into many things. And when it is said that in the possible intellect, all things come to be, we should not understand that all things are there in the manner of matter, for matter does not become the form. Whereas when it is said that possible intellect is all intelligized things, we should understand that it is that very form in a certain way. Here, Albert denies not only that the possible intellect is matter, but even that it is matter-like in the manner of matter, so an immaterial substrate. His reasons are that, 1, intellect remains what it is, whole and indivisible when it receives form, and 2, that intellect is wholly converted into the form it receives. Sound like conflicting claims, but he'll have a solution for reconciling them. And the Kindi and Farabian echo here is no accident. Albert immediately invokes Farabi's modified wax analogy. He says, indeed, Al-Farabius already said something similar before us. Namely, that one should imagine that the whole wax goes over into the shape of the seal so that nothing of it is distinguished from the very shape of the seal. However, Albert's worried that this way of putting it is a little misleading. And actually, in response to Farabi, Avicenna raises some worries about incoherence. He thinks that claims about identity would mean that then the intelligible takes over intellect, so it will replace intellect and there'll be nothing left of intellect. So Albert suggests another analogy of his own which he thinks fits in every way with what he wants to say about thought being. Albert's better analogy, it turns out, is an example of two things that seem at first to have different natures or essences, but are really the same nature existing two different ways. And these are the brightness of air and color in the air on its way to the eye. For Albert, following what was at the time a widely accepted Avicennian paradigm, when the sun is shining, it fills the surrounding air with light, making it bright or illuminated and thereby actually transparent, and also generates colors on solid surfaces. Now, one might think that the brightness in the air and the redness of the apple are two different kinds of qualities, having different natures. But Albert insists they are actually the same nature. The brightness and the color red are both light. The difference between the two is only a difference in being, meaning that brightness and the color red differ only as two instances of light. In this case, they would be differentiated by the receiver. They're different entities or beings, but have the same nature. That is why Albert explains when the illuminated air receives the redness of the apple on the way to the eye for sight, it does not do so, quote, such that one would be the subject and the other the form. For the receiving illuminated transparent and the received color are of the same nature, end quote. And this only makes sense because if light is receiving more light, this can't be a kind of composition. But if it's not composition, what is it? And more on that in a moment. So intellect and thought, Albert concludes, are related in the same way as the illumination and the color in the air. When he says, it is clear from the above that there is the same form in the possible intellect and in matter, but it does not take any individuation from intellect. That's an interesting point, but we won't talk about it. And it is also clear that in all such cases, the intelligizing intellect and the intelligized form are actually the same, differing only in being, esse, in just the way that the illuminated transparent, in the place where there is abstracted color, is actually the same nature as the color, differing only by their being, which being is implied in the definition of both. And it's also clear that possible intellect is not a matter, but a form. So the point is that when possible intellect receives cat thought, an immaterial form is receiving a form of the same nature. However that occurs, it cannot be a case of composition because there are not two natures to compose. Rather, both have just one nature, the nature of thought. When intellect receives thought, no matter which kind of thought or how many, it's just getting more of what it already is. So the broader metaphysical significance of this claim is dramatic. So we can consider substance as divided into body and thought. Then on the one side, under the genus body, we have a sprawling Porphyrian tree differentiated into narrower and narrower, really differentiated essences: body, animal, insect, flea. On the other side, under the genus thought, there is no further differentiation, no different subgenre of thought or differentiated thought natures. Thinker and thought are not different natures, but one nature. Indeed, for thought, there is not even the categorical difference of substance and accident. There is just thought, full stop. Thus, Albert explains, quote, "Opposition and disparity and diversity and all such do not belong to forms except insofar as they are in matter. But insofar as they're in the light of the age and intellect, abstracted from matter to acquire the being of thought, they are simple, indivisible, and united because they are originally one and the same in the first cause, and therefore in its light they are united to each other, not giving way to each other or excluding each other, and especially because they are not in the intellect as in matter or in a subject properly speaking." End quote. So for Albert, as for Alexander, form all alone just is thought. And in that condition, obeying the metaphysics of thought, rose form and oak form have the same nature and are united as one. It is only as in forming matter that they are divided and opposed to each other, constituting entities that have different natures, roses versus oak trees. And yet, there must be some structure in thought being. After all, my thought is not your thought. A rose thought is not the same as a tree thought. So there has to be some kind of multiplication and differentiation for thought being, even if it doesn't arise through any kind of composition. So what kind of metaphysical structure is proper to thought being? We can call Albert's answer the progressive determination view, which is sketched most clearly in his commentary on De Anima. And there's a long quote here, which is worth taking a close look at. "When the universal is united to the possible intellect, it is not united to it as though the intellect were an organ, as occurs with sensible forms." There's the denial of the substrate again. "Rather, it is united to the intellect as a determinans is to something being determined. For the connatural habit of possible intellect, which is its intellectuality, whereby possible intellect is called and is an intellectual nature, is of the same nature as the intelligibles qua intelligibles. But its intellectuality is confused and indeterminate, and it is determined as potency is determined by actuality, and as the indeterminate is perfected by the determinate. And therefore, the intelligible is not one with the possible intellect in the manner in which subject and accident are one, for the accident is not the perfection of the subject. Nor are they one in the manner in which matter and form are one, for form perfects matter only with a distinct and divided being, whereas the universal is indistinct and undivided, and it does not perfect in being, but is rather the principle of cognition of those things that are. Otherwise, we would have to say that the intellect would be a stone when intelligizing stone, or an ass when intelligizing ass. In other words, thought being does not compose with anything. Rather, it just becomes increasingly determinate. For Albert, although it's very convenient to talk as though the soul is one thing and the form it receives another thing, the reality is quite different. The human intellectual soul is an immaterial form, and therefore a thought being. But it starts out as an indeterminate thought, which must become progressively more determinate. Abstracted pelican form does not get added to soul form like two composed forms. Rather, the soul form becomes pelican form, which is to say, it becomes more determinate. Since these forms are all thought, the only difference between soul form and pelican form is that the latter is more determinate than the former. Each new thought is not added to the soul, but just is the soul as it takes on increasingly complex determinacy. So for Albert, the structure proper to thought being is determinacy, and to acquire thought in this picture is to make my own pre-existing thought being ever more determinate, until it reflects the complete determinacy of the Porphyrian tree on the other side. Obviously, Albert does not want determinacy to be understood as an accident or form, and I would suggest that it should be understood as something more like a mode, but we can talk about this more during the Q&A. This is a tentative thought. So at this point, we now have Albert's full answer to the problem of the substrate of thought. Like the other de intellectu authors before him, he denies that intellect is a substrate for thought, and he joins with Kindi and Farabi in even more radically denying that there's any substrate for thought, since substratehood implies composition, opposition, and division that is alien to thought being. Like Kindi and Farabi, Albert holds that the intellectual soul, which is already an immaterial form in its own right, does not acquire thoughts as accidents or forms, but downright merges with them. But Albert works out a detailed metaphysics of thought structure that avoids the obvious objection on which such a merger would erase the soul form and replace it with another form. Thought, he insists, has its own kind of structure, which involves a progressively increasing determinacy rather than differentiation into competing natures. There's no erasing because there's no structures of opposition in the being of thought. For intellect to receive an abstracted thought is just for it to become a more determinate thought in its own right. Albert can thus double down on the impassibility of intellect. In becoming identified with cat thought, indeterminate thought does not change because it does not cease to be thought. To the contrary, it only becomes more perfectly what it is. And this picture also allows for thought being to have complexity without any opposition. Duality in the sense of opposition can be had only in relation to something other than thought itself. This thought is mine and not yours because it is individuated by my body. And pelican thought and rose thought can be said to be two thoughts only extrinsically by reference to pelicans and roses. Otherwise, in themselves, they are one thought which is determined both rose-wise and pelican-wise. My examples are getting away from me. So, to summarize then, the de intellectu tradition from Alexander to Albert presents thought as one of the main kinds of being alongside bodies. But the tradition splits on how to integrate thought being into a unified metaphysical system. The Alexandrian approach seeks to standardize metaphysical structure across all beings, thoughts, and bodies. Whereas the Kindian, Farabi, and Albertist approach accords to thought a sui generis structure, restricting the compositional matter form or substance accident structure of Aristotle's categories to material things like roses and pelicans. This tension sets the stage for the development of two further positions in the 13th century, which today are much more familiar to us. One is Aquinas's, which, like Alexander's, seeks to standardize metaphysical structure across all beings. Like Alexander, Aquinas holds that human thought is an accident received into a substrate, and that the possible intellect is just a potency of that substrate. But whereas Alexander holds that the substrate is a bodily organ, Aquinas makes it be the human soul. So in Aquinas, we can distinguish an ordinary material hylomorphism from a parallel immaterial composition that we might call noomorphism. So there's material substrates with forms and accidents, and there's also thought substrates, with their forms and accidents. The other view, associated with Henry of Ghent and later Scotus, ultimately becomes the dominant position in Latin scholasticism. On that view, following in Kindian, Farabi, and Albertist footsteps, our intellect is a form that receives other forms, though without being composed or being affected by them in the manner of a substrate. But then comes an important modification. Instead of giving thought being its own sui generis structure to handle the unaffectability of intellect, this new view drains thought being of all of its reality, giving it a sui generis metaphysical status as merely intentional being. Thus, these thinkers can keep using the language of composition without having to mean it, because when intellect receives thought, it's not receiving a real accident or form. Intellect is unaffected by thought, not because intellect is already thought or because it's merging with thought, but rather because thought is not a real accident in intellect, but only intentional being. Thus, this intentional being view also has something in common with the standardizing impulse of Alexander and Aquinas after all. Metaphysics must be unified. There should be just one kind of metaphysical structure across all created real being. But, and here the view makes a sharp U-turn to exit the de intellectu tradition completely, if thought cannot sustain that unified structure, then it cannot be real being. And so thought is banished from real being to become something merely intentional. Thank you.